Before I begin my opening statement, I want to go back to a discussion that we had in this committee at the last hearing. It was a climate hearing. On your side of the aisle, it was touted a September 2021 IMF working paper on fossil fuel subsidies. This paper supposedly bolsters the view that climate catastrophe is on the horizon. You explicitly called it a peer-reviewed in order to support the case. On page 2 of that paper in question reads, quote, IMF working papers describe research in progress by the authors and are published to elicit comments and to encourage debate. The views expressed in the IMF working papers are those of the author and do not necessarily represent the views of the IMF, its executive board, or IMF management, end of quote. Dr. Roger Pilkey, a nonpartisan climate scientist who has testified at the invitation of both Democrats and Republicans, provided further insight on this study in response to a question for the record. I asked him in that question for the record if a meeting between the IMF director and Democratic senators has any bearing on whether an IMF working paper is peer-reviewed. He responded, quote, the IMF working paper would be properly called a preprint in scientific community. That is, not the equivalent of a peer review paper, end of quote, and then further quoting. Any single peer-reviewed paper is typically a small contribution to knowledge of a particular topic. Most papers offer less than that, end of quote. He then further followed up by saying, quote, peer-reviewed literature provides an ample resource for those who might wish to cherry-pick those individual articles that might seem to offer the best support for a preferred position. This may be useful in political advocacy or posturing, but it does not offer a reliable route to effective analysis that might inform policy, end of quote. If the committee is to continue focusing on climate change, it's important that we listen to nonpartisan scientists rather than speculate with international bureaucrats. Now on to my opening statement.
Well, may I respond to that?
Yes, you
just
sure
briefly,
can.
because we actually had the president of the IMF in for a briefing to the Budget Committee. Every member was invited. No member on your side chose to attend. The president walked through how this worked, and she said that the methodology of that IMF report is in fact peer-reviewed, but because it is done repeatedly, they don't peer-review each individual report, but she confirmed that the methodology is in fact peer-reviewed. And second, she made very clear that the IMF does endorse and support and stand behind those reports. So if, sadly, nobody was there to see her say that, but that is what she said, and please go ahead with the rest of your statement.
Okay. Our nation is over $32 trillion in debt, yet this committee is holding the 11th hearing on climate change. President Biden is on television bragging about his economic performance when Americans can't afford groceries and gasoline. Our spending is out of control, and Democrats haven't written a budget in the past 2 years. As I've said many times, climate change is a topic very worthy of discussion. I'm the father of the wind energy tax credit, as you said about Iowa getting so much of our electricity from wind. I fought for renewable energy long before climate change became such a political popular topic. Democrats called this hearing to discuss the fiscal impact of climate change on the infrastructure. I imagine we'll hear some expensive estimates and alarming anecdotes about the impact of severe weather events on infrastructure, but there isn't a single expert in this room who is qualified as a climate scientist to attribute those estimates and anecdotes explicitly to climate change. However, several panelists are more than capable of discussing major policy issues, like our broken federal permitting system, which continues to impede critical infrastructure projects. These projects would make our infrastructure more resilient to weather, stronger for everyday use, and would reduce emissions. But environmental permitting delays caused by environmental groups and friends in Congress continue to drive up federal infrastructure spending along with the energy bills and taxes of our constituents. This is why I'm excited to welcome Mrs. Apsey. She's President and CEO of ITC Holding, the largest independent electricity transmission company in the United States. ITC operates more than 6,600 circuit miles of transmission lines in Iowa, Minnesota, Illinois, and Missouri. As head of a company that actually is building infrastructure, Mrs. Apsey will highlight the real reasons why our electric grid is in peril and why we are unable to complete transmission projects like the Cardinal Hickory Creek one in Dubuque County, Iowa. Her testimony is one that my friends on the other side of the aisle simply don't want to hear, while accusing the fossil fuel industry of corruption and accusing those they disagree with of criminal activity. There's support astronomically unrealistic electric vehicles and renewable energy goals, but they're unwilling to support reform to environmental legislation like NEPA and the Clean Water Act, which impede the construction of the same infrastructure necessary to even attempt to meet those goals. Few experts understand this better than Mr. Hergott, President and CEO of the Permitting Institute. He worked to limit permitting delays for infrastructure projects while at the White House, where he served as both Executive Director of the Federal Permitting Improvement Steering Council and Director of Infrastructure at the Council of Environmental Quality. Mr. Hergott will show us that the Democrats' grand vision of renewable energies are just that, unless they reverse the course as their disastrous permitting positions. From Iowa to Rhode Island, our nation's roads, bridges, waterways, and energy infrastructures are essential to America's economy, trade, and vitality. I'm sure all of us here, as well as those senators on EPA and Energy Natural Resource Committees, can agree that we can work together to craft legislation to improve our national infrastructure in order to reduce our ballooning national debt. Thank you.